Shalom everyone, Yoel again, and I hope people are enjoying these videos. I want to talk something again in the field of tradition, but it is connected to Torah, and I will be talking about Hebrew today. So I'm moving around a bit, that chair is uncomfortable. Thank you. In any case, a very, very common thing that's come up lately is an issue of women covering their hair. Do women have to cover their hair? What does the Torah actually say about it? And is there actually any specific way of covering your hair? Is there a specific style you have to wear? As I said in my previous video about customs, what you do and what you wear and the style you wear does define certain things about who you identify yourself with. Okay, as though I understand that people don't like being put inside a box and things like that, it's still something which defines a lot of elements about who you are. So if you wear a certain style, if it's very colorful, if it's very plain, it does define what group you identify yourself with. Now, first of all, going to the subject of do women have to cover their hair? I'm not going to be talking about things which are mentioned in the New Testament. Yes, I know about the whole thing about the husband being the covering, etc. It's been quoted to me many, many times by wonderful people who ask me questions. However, what does the Torah actually say, and what do we know about ancient customs? Now, first of all, I have to be very, very blunt here. The issue of covering one's hair, a woman covering her hair, is something that's been around in Judaism for a very, very long time. However, it varies from one culture to the other. Some people completely cover their hair, some people only partially cover their hair, and in some places people didn't cover their hair at all. Okay, it really is something to do with the culture they lived in. Okay, and we're talking about people who are religious. We're not talking about people who just, maybe sometimes when they go to synagogue and things like that, they covered their hair or didn't cover their hair and they were completely religious, completely Torah observant. However, what does the Torah actually say? So we have the story of Sotah, the description of the Sotah in the book of Numbers. And there's a very specific verse there which has to do with the part of the humiliation of the woman in the situation where there might be a suspicion of adultery. And please, I'm not going to go into the subject of the whole, what does it mean there and what are the symbolic ideas of, but there's one very simple thing that happens there. The verse says, Ufara et rosh ha'isha. Okay, that noise over there was a bottle making noise, so sorry about that. The verse says, Ufara et rosh ha'isha. The root para, and I'm going to try to put the verse below in Hebrew with the root, and the word is para, which can mean to make wild or expose. Now, the root itself as well appears in two other places in the Torah. And when it's better to discuss things about in the Torah only with verses from the Torah. There's an interesting law in rabbinic Judaism where if you're discussing something from the Torah, it's better off to bring examples only from the Torah because then they're considered to be equals, which means it's quite possible that they actually understood the idea of layers of language. A word can mean something else later on in latter Hebrew. So the root para itself appears with Aaron making the hair of certain people either exposed or wild. It says that Aaron para the hair or the heads of the people who were worshipping the golden ox, the golden calf, and then you also have the Nazarite says Ugedal pera se'ar rosho. Okay, so there we actually know as a fact that pera se'ar rosho means to make wild. A Nazarite, one of the things that show a person who's a Nazarite is the fact that the hair is not only very long but also wild, because men used to organize their hair, they used to tidy up their hair, something braid their hair. Men used to groom themselves as well, and used to have very, very long hair. And the thing is that the only case that we can say quite clearly that para means anything is the verse in Numbers that talks about the Nazarite, which by the way is adjacent to the description about the woman. So it seems to be very, very clear, at least from this comparing these points, that ufarat isha means to actually make wilds, which raises a question: so did she have her head cover or not? Because many people want to say Ufarat rosh ha'isha actually means that he exposed her hair. But because this has a bit more of a symbolic idea of being wild, as if there's nothing taming the person, it seems to be more logical that not only from the linguistic point of view, but also from the symbolic idea behind it, that you make the hair wild, which means it raises the question, did women really cover their hair in the First Temple period? Now, hair covering is attested in Assyrian laws, for example. There's a late Assyrian law, 145 to 146, I think, and I posted it before on Facebook, that says that women had to cover their hair and was even punishable. Excuse me. Very, very extreme. However, we don't know if this was the law in Israel. The Torah doesn't specifically say anything. As I've said before, the Torah defines law, not custom. So in other words, it's quite possible to say that head covering is more of a custom, less of a Torah law. And even if it says that the woman's hair was exposed, but there's no actual direct commandment in the Torah to cover hair, means that even if women did cover their hair, it was more of a custom and not a Torah law. So in other words, it seems to be, and again, I'll be open to hearing arguments against this, it seems to be quite logical that women are not commanded to cover their hair. However, it is the custom, and my wife does that, my mother does that, and most of my religious relatives do. And the other question that comes up is, how much do you have to cover? Which is already something which is very diverse. Some people cover everything, some people cover only part. There's even a practice that women shave their heads, which has its own history to it. But in any case, at the end of the day, it seems to be that it was a custom. Now, if people want to identify themselves with being Jewish, or identify themselves as being a part of a very specific Jewish group, then the head cover does define that. Okay? But from analyzing the actual text itself, seems to be that there's no actual Torah commandment to cover hair, which means that if a woman does not cover her hair and even walks outside in the street with her hair exposed, it does not make her a sinner, or, I'm going to use that word quite loosely, but it does not make her as if she's breaking Torah. However, in Jewish custom, in Talmudic sources, it was very clear that women did cover their hair. However, they did not necessarily cover their hair at home or even in the garden. If they, for example, leave the house and go out, for example, to a garden or to a backyard or something, they would cover their hair, only partially. And if they go to the street, then they actually had to fully cover their hair. So it was something that was more done in public, not necessarily at home. Okay, so it raises the question, what did they do when there were guests over? So the other side of that as well is that when they had guests over, they actually separated the men from women, and women had their own little room, and men had their own other room, and they were not necessarily mixed together, which is another thing that, can be discussed in another video. But at the end of the day, when it comes to Torah law, it doesn't seem to me to be that women have to cover their hair. However, by Jewish custom, by Jewish law, it is something that women are supposed to do. And I think it's more of a decision that a woman has to make, especially if it just doesn't necessarily come from the Jewish world. It's something that I think is a woman's freedom to choose if she decides to cover her hair or not. I know, again, this is a little bit controversial. For some people, this is something which is very important. I can see the very, very beautiful head covers that certain women, which are friends of mine on Facebook, put a picture up of what they're covering their hair with and things like that, which is, totally awesome, as the people say. But at the end of the day, when it comes to Torah law, it does not seem to be that there is an obligation to cover your hair. Hope people enjoy these videos. Again, if you want to contact me, I have a Facebook page, Hebrew in Israel, or you can contact me by email, Hebrew in Israel, one word, no capitals, @gmail.com. Thank you very much.